Phil. Great, turning the NavyCon concept on its head in all the best ways, in my opinion. All right. Next up, and finally for this panel, is Nick Narbutovskih. Nick will be presenting on A Fortress for All My Friends. He spends the majority of his time engaged in the business of national security. He writes compulsively over lunch breaks and late at night, and reads a lot more than is entirely healthy. He writes the weekly classics column at Metastellar and is published there and in Air and Space Power Journal and the Over the Horizon Journal, with both fiction and nonfiction works. He's spoken on leadership and geopolitics at the U.S. Air Force's Squadron Officer School and at NavyCon 2020A. So you can come join the conversation with him at narbutov.com, and he's on all the usual social media. Nick, you're up. Good to see you again, buddy.
Hey, thanks, Ian. I appreciate it. So, man, I'm so glad to be back here at NavyCon. Really excited to talk to you about one of my favorite franchises here, and that is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Of course, I'm going to start it in the middle of the slideshow. Don't worry, we're not going to Quentin Tarantino this. All right, so moving along. So this is the overall slide about what you're going to see today. We're going to talk a little bit about joint warfare. We're going to figure out what the military is actually for anyways. And then my favorite part is like, wait a second, didn't they already do that on Star Trek? The answer to most questions that relate to Star Trek is yes, that already happened. But first, I'd like to point out a little gem from Star Trek DS9, Season 6, Episode 2, in which Chief O'Brien and the disgraced Cardassian, definitely not Russian spy, Ellen Garry, are talking. So O'Brien says, there are rules, Garrick, even in a war, and Garrick's response is a classic Cardassian one, in that humans have rules in war, rules that tend to make victory a little harder to achieve. So keep that in the back of your head. We're going to dive right in here to joint warfare. So this all started when I was digging through some doctrine as part of my job and trying to figure out what exactly is joint warfare. We hear the term thrown around all over the place. Is it a document? Is it something the Marines have a chokehold on? Is it just another way to refer to the Army? Heck, I don't know. So it even comes in a bottle, apparently. You can get joint warfare. Thanks, Amazon. 2-day shipping. But no, this is joint warfare. We've got the air, land, and sea forces. We got the Space Force. We got the cyber component. Don't worry, I'm sure the Marines and the Army are actually on the ship somewhere. But the question is, where is this defined? So if you go to JP1, Doctrine for the Armed Forces of the United States, you flip through it and you look for this phrase, joint warfare, it's not actually in there. You'll get mostly charts like these where it tells you ways to create things which do joint warfare, but it never actually says joint warfare is this. So to get the definition of joint warfare, we're going to the best and most reliable source on the internet, Wikipedia. So, yes, Professor Karsten, it is a legitimate source. I want my points back from my MSS 400 paper back in the day in the academy. According to Wikipedia, joint warfare is the military doctrine which places priority on the integration of various service branches of a state's armed forces into one unified command. But JP1 provides us with this definition, a very simple one. Warfare is simply the mechanism, method, or modality of conflict against the enemy. So let's go ahead and unpack that a little bit. Actually, let's not, because this is a short conference. We're just going to go ahead and summarize it. So warfare is how you do war, and joint warfare is how you do war with friends. Great, we've got a very simple piece of this put together. War with friends, joint warfare, great. Joint Doctrine Note 119 comes out. Now, I'm not a huge fan of doctrine because it's hard to get through. However, I do like notes because they're short. Now we have the competition continuum, and I thought to myself, perfect, something I'm familiar with. The transdimensional space where beings of incredible power create Faustian competitions between captains of the Enterprise. Turns out I was wrong, not that continuum. No, the continuum, the competition continuum, has 3 different bands, none of which is Whitesnake, unfortunately, but there is cooperation, competition, and conflict. In cooperation, it's pretty straightforward. We're cooperating with people towards a common end. Competition, We were competing for resources, influence, power, something like that. And conflict is where that competition has spilled over into the point where we're actually using kinetic or non-kinetic means to go to war. So this is a traditional warfare, is in the conflict realm. So that seems relatively straightforward. But so what? Isn't this just putting lipstick onto the pig? The answer is actually further down in the document. So according to JDN 119, the US military is no longer going to plan military-only operations. It talks about integrated campaign planning. Integrated campaign planning has a huge definition, but I'm going to go ahead and pull the easy part, or the hard parts, out of that, and we're just going to look at these words here. So combination, cooperation, competition, and conflict. So we're combining all three of those bands of the competition continuum into a campaign plan. This is a pretty big departure from normal military operations. But then this last part, and here's the kicker: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic efforts. We're talking about a whole of government campaign plan here. So you add on to that we have to support strategic objectives, which arguably at the highest levels they always were. But we're talking about fully all the way down to the bottom level of a campaign plan, strategic objectives, not just tactical and not just operational. So this is the critical question for the strategist. So what? What do we do with this information? We have a new way of fighting war. We have a competition continuum instead of just looking at war and not war. How is this going to go? If only we had some sort of a thought experiment that had been through this. Some sort of military commander had to plan and execute a campaign that spans cooperation, competition, and conflict, all while integrating civil instruments of power. So I'd like to stay here all night and lob some good-natured pot shots at both Star Trek and the other franchise, which shall not be named. However, let's go ahead and break this down and show how Star Trek Deep Space Nine actually got it right all the way back in the 90s. So if you're not familiar with Star Trek Deep Space Nine, throughout the entire run, Captain Benjamin Sisko commanded a fortress that used to be run by an evil superpower that then oppressed the local Bajorans until Starfleet came along and took control of the nation, where they helped the Bajorans and some local businesses get back on their feet. They also dealt with some rather disgruntled extremists and helped to increase the infrastructure and get people back on their feet. So they did this all while stabilizing the geopolitical situation and preparing to counter the evil Jem'Hadar foot soldiers of the Dominion, should they ever actually want to land some troops instead of just trying to upset the local balance of power through other means. So remember, in DS9, when Gul Dukat, the Cardassian, he was the prefect of Bajor when the fortress was controlled by the Cardassians. He actually knowingly left children behind in order to, years later, after they had grown up and been raised by the local Bajorans, come back and claim that it was really important to repatriate those ethnic Cardassians back to their homeland. And so they had a right to be there, and the Cardassians needed to establish their own piece of Bajor that was theirs, right? You might as well scream Crimea to the Russians. Now, the Quark factor. Whether you like Quark or not, he was definitely a significant part of the show. So Quark was a shopkeeper on Deep Space Nine who had a completely accurate moral compass according to the Ferengi, which kind of put him opposite of Odo, who was the shape-shifting security chief on the station in more than one episode. However, he was still a symbol of the local economy and an absolute staple on the station. If you look at the way Bagram is set up these days, there are so many shopkeepers who flock to the base every day in order to hawk their wares and hopefully create a little bit of that American dream in Afghanistan. Handmade suits, people, I'm telling you, if you ever go there, it's worth it. Get the three-piece. Very nice. And lastly, let's talk about the Dominion. So in 2370, the discovery of the Bajoran wormhole brought the Dominion into contact with the civilizations in the Alpha Quadrant. Starfleet, being who they were, threatened to destroy the wormhole if the Dominion ever actually invaded. So the Dominion took a competition stance, not a conflict stance, and sought to build support and their own power base. Reference the Search Part 2, The Adversary, if you're looking for actual episodes. In 2373, they were so effective at this that only 3 years later, they actually managed to take over the entire Cardassian Empire, which gave them a beachhead of power here in the Alpha Quadrant, as well as free transit of the wormhole. So the Dominion was pretty effective, but I'm hoping that the Dominion is not actually China. And throughout all of this, the intrepid crew of the Star Trek Deep Space Nine's battle station, sorry, not a battle station anymore, took part in all kinds of other small security operations. Eventually, it got to the point where they had their own dedicated battleship in the form of the USS Defiant, and they would take that ship and conduct actual military operations, offensive. But don't worry, they were peacekeeping missions because Starfleet does not have a military, as we all know. So what again? Let's kind of recap the things that we've talked about today. First of all, we had to define our terms. That's important. Warfare is how you do war. Joint warfare is just warfare with friends. We talked about the competition continuum, which is a new way of thinking and fighting and planning campaigns, cooperation, competition, and conflict. And remember, those campaigns are no longer just limited to military objectives and the tactical and operational levels. We're talking about a whole of government approach to strategic end states. And if you live outside of the Department of Defense, Department of State, or even don't even work in the government, you might assume that when we plan a war or we plan an action, it's a seamless proposition right now. Let me tell you, that is far from the truth. Everybody wants to do the right thing, but everybody has different ideas about it. Integrating these campaigns and planning across the spectrum is going to be a huge shift in the way we do things. And remember, Deep Space Nine is basically space Sparta. We could learn a lot. That's all I had. I'll turn it back to Ian. Thanks very much.
All right. Fantastic job, Nick, as always. Thank you so much.